So welcome everyone to the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment session on the UK's agricultural seasonal worker visa scheme. And in this session, we're looking at whether the UK can ethically recruit workers into the agricultural sector using the agricultural seasonal worker visa scheme. My name's Kate Roberts and I work for a small UK NGO called Flex, or Focus on Labour Exploitation. And the panelists today are Frank Hansen from the GLAA, the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority, Sharon Cross from G's Fresh, and Sam Zubaidi, I hope I've said that right, Sam, from Proforce. I'll let all my panelists introduce themselves properly in a minute. Just to say a couple of words first about Focus on Labour Exploitation. We're a small policy and research NGO, and we very much, we conduct policy and research work towards ending trafficking for labour exploitation. However, we very much recognise that exploitation takes part on a spectrum. So we're not only interested in trafficking, we're interested in lower end labour exploitation and very much preventing and mitigating exploitation before it happens. So we're very much interested in working collaboratively towards best practice. We've been interested in links between migration and access to rights and best practice for many years. And back in 2019, Flex conducted research into the pilot seasonal worker project, the seasonal worker pilot, back in 2021. And our research the pilot was in 2019. We conducted research which we published in 2021 on the pilot in Scotland. We're currently conducting ongoing research on the scheme as it is now. And just to say a few words in background on the scheme before I ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, the context to the scheme itself is in the UK's departure from the EU, the end of free movement resulting inevitably in a need for the UK to proactively address the implications of this for its workforce. Particularly in sectors which do rely heavily on migrant labour. So the seasonal worker visa, as I've said, was introduced as a pilot, initially of just 2,500 workers in 2019, and it's since been expanded quite rapidly, first to 10,000 workers in 2020, 30,000 workers in 2021, and 40,000 workers this year. And there's plans for the scheme to continue until 2024, but there's no plans for beyond that at present. The countries that workers have been recruited from have also grown, and currently workers are coming from, can be recruited from anywhere in the world, with workers coming from as far as afield as Uzbekistan, Nepal, and Indonesia. And from Flex's perspective, we see some issues as that decisions on the scheme have often come with little warning from government, which has meant for very short-term timeframes for planning and obviously carrying out, putting in place regulation and enforcement and carrying out due diligence checks in countries of origin. And, possibly not as a huge surprise, investigations such as recent investigations by The Guardian have found workers alleging to have paid recruitment fees which are banned under the scheme, amounting in some cases to over £5,000. So obviously this is dire for the workers who've often borrowed money at very high interests and are under huge amounts of pressure to pay this back, putting them at risk of debt bondage. But it also causes problems throughout the scheme and exposes many gaps around the regulation and enforcement in international recruitment. And raises questions around jurisdiction and accountability and the options for those workers to access redress. We also hear about mismatched expectations with workers coming into the scheme who may not have previous experience of agricultural work, or don't find the working conditions they'd expected. So these issues, they're within the 6 month. So the seasonal worker visa is generally for 6 months, but there are shorter term. There are some short term visas even within that. Last year, in September 2021, the government announced shorter term 3 month visas for HGV drivers and for poultry workers. And coming up in November, we've got some 8 week long visas for poultry workers. So there's a lot to unpack here, and we're really lucky, as I say, to be joined by this panel of experts from the GLAA and G's Fresh and Proforce. So I will ask each panel member to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll launch into questions. I don't know if Frank, maybe you would like to introduce yourself first, and then Sharon, and then Sam.
Thanks, Kate, and good afternoon, everyone. As Kate said, I'm Frank Hansen. I'm Head of Prevention and Partnerships at the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority. Just very briefly, the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority, or the GLAA, it's a government-sponsored agency. We're officially classed as a non-departmental public body. We were established to protect vulnerable and exploited workers, and particularly working in partnership to achieve that aim. We have 3 core functions. We are a regulator, and I can talk a bit more about that as we go through the panel discussion. We're also a law enforcement agencies with a range of powers, and we've got a remit around prevention. And I think, again, as we discuss in the panel, it is that latter, the prevention role, that our focus, particularly with the seasonal worker scheme, is really dominating our work in that.
Yeah, hello, my name's Sharon Cross, and as we've said, I work for a company called G's Fresh. It is a large, private, family-owned business. We farm around 13,000 hectares across the world. We're not just in the UK, but for the purpose of this call, we farm currently just over 6,000 hectares in the UK. We have about 1,500 permanent workers, but we also use about 3,000 seasonal workers in a year. In the UK, we grow salad products in the summer. We don't have the same availability for work in the winter, and so hence the seasonality. For the purpose of this, we would be classed as what is a labour user. So the UK at the moment, like many other countries, has an issue with availability of labour. We can't source enough people to come and work from the UK in the harvesting operations, so we use the operators to provide us and help us with our staffing that we need.
I'm Sam Zubaidi, Compliance Manager at Proforce. So Proforce is one of the operators of the scheme in its current format, so the seasonal worker scheme. Proforce also has been one of the original operators when it was the seasonal workers pilot, beginning a few years ago. We're happy that there's been an announcement in the last few days that we've been awarded the poultry licence going forwards, and we're with bated breath waiting for news about the horticulture licence as well. And yeah, we supply close to 100 clients for the purposes of the seasonal workers scheme, one of whom is G's. And so just a note that we also operate a hybrid model. So we've got part of the business which is what would be known as an agency, where we supply clients, sometimes also same clients that we supply for the seasonal worker scheme, via a usual agency model as well. So that's me.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So actually, the first question I wanted to put was to Frank, and it builds on really your introduction to the GLAA, Frank. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about how the role of the GLAA has changed since it was established as the GLA, and how you feel the GLA can best meet the GLAA apologies can best meet the needs of the changing context and its growing remit, which has changed quite considerably since it was formed.
Yeah. So originally we were called the Gang Masters Licensing Authority, and that was established in 2005. It's really with a core purpose, a statutory licensing scheme, and that was to regulate businesses that supplied workers to the agricultural, horticultural, shellfish gathering, and the associated packaging and processing of those industries. And that remained the case up until 2016, when we were renamed, as Kate just said, to the Gang Masters and Labour Abuse Authority. And with that came new statutory powers and increased resources. And the following year, we brought into the organisation specially trained officers, labour abuse prevention officers, and they had the powers to investigate modern slavery and labour abuse offences. Those powers were restricted to England and Wales, so we currently don't have those powers in Scotland and Northern Ireland. But basically, they are police-style powers, so they allow us to investigate those cases where we need to make arrests, seize evidence, and interview, while still retaining the gangmasters' powers that are applicable across the whole of the UK. In effect, what that means is we're looking at the modern slavery offences across the economy of the UK. So whilst our initial role was very much concentrated in those sectors that we licensed, we now look and identify risks of modern slavery, labour exploitation right across the economy. And so that includes, identifying high-risk sectors such as construction, hand car washes, nail bars, textiles, hospitality, a whole range of diverse sectors with very different risks, which require then a strategy for how we can really work in partnership. And I think the big point to make is how incredibly small we are, even with the additional resources. So as an organisation, our total workforce is currently about 125, of which about 50 to 60 are operational, working in syndicates across the country. So we know the scale and threat of exploitation is huge. Therefore, we do need to work in partnership, and it's that last area where we feel we can be most effective, and that's the prevention. I think to protect vulnerable workers, the best way is to stop it from happening in the first place. So we're looking to develop a range of activities, interventions, which can give us that kind of preventative role, and obviously working with operators, labour providers, labour users is key to that.
Thank you. I mean, do you in terms of prevention and stopping it happening in the first place? I think I think further questions will that I wanted to ask about this. I think are very very relevant to that desire, and I just wanted to ask you about the implications for labour market enforcement as the scheme has expanded. In terms, as I said in the introduction, of the numbers of visas available and the countries people are coming from. And in terms of the challenges of international enforcement and access to justice, as you say, the GLAA is small. What do you think? How do you think the GLAA can begin to meet some of those challenges? what is the role of the GLAA in this new context?
I think, and it's really important to stress this, that the GLAA doesn't have any remit to investigate labour exploitation in other countries. And I think if any exploitation is taking place, then it's really important that those countries and their governments and their agencies investigate and obviously take the appropriate action. This seasonal worker scheme, and I think that secondly, is also a government-run scheme through the Home Office and through DEFRA, the two government departments. The GLAA don't have that responsibility for the scheme, but what we do see is we've got a really important role to support those government agencies and support the scheme operators in how that how the seasonal worker scheme is run, and to give that support again through interventions that have a prevention drive towards that. So from a prevention perspective, building those messages that we can carry, I think, they're using the term upstream, to where workers who are thinking about coming to the UK, that they've got the knowledge, they've got the awareness of what to expect when they come to the UK to work on a farm under the seasonal worker scheme is really important. And that's why we have been working with the 4 scheme operators in particular to help push that message to where it needs to go, at the source of those countries where workers are being recruited. And I think secondly, we can also help extend that through developing communications with embassies, with labour attaches, with NGOs who are working on the ground in those countries. So again, our role is to really kind of add value and enhance that kind of prevention message, so people have got that understanding of what to expect. They've got the understanding of their employment rights, and they know and have the confidence to report issues if those concerns materialise when they come to the UK.
Thank you. So maybe that leads on quite nicely to a question to Sharon, which is just to ask about why effective enforcement within the scheme is so important for growers, as well as everyone in the scheme. And are there any particular areas in which you think enforcement needs strengthening, and whose role do you see this as?
So I'll speak generally, because this is not just it's just not about the scheme in terms of why we think it's important. We want, when people come to work for any agricultural business, but I'll talk about the one I'm employed by G's. We want to know that the people who we are employing have been able to come and choose the job freely, have been free of any kind of exploitation, any kind of additional fees. It's important to us because it's a family value. For retailers, they will have their own views, their own reasons for doing it. It could be about brand, but also, to be fair, most people I speak to, which is within the ethical side of things, they want to know that people who are working within their supply chain are also treated really well. So they will put processes and places for organisations such as yourself to check that through. But we want people who have been able to come into the UK and work for G's that have not been exploited, that have been able to come of their own free will without taking on any kind of debt, without having to take huge loans out, without being beholden to anybody else. And that's important to us. It's a given right, if you like, in terms of how we feel about it. In terms of who do we feel is responsible and where do we think the enforcement needs to change? The the GLAA have had an involvement in agriculture, as mentioned earlier, for a very long time, and we've always worked with them, and we recognise that even for just the remit within the UK and the areas they cover, that the budget they have, it's underfunded. If we want to make a real impact in terms of how that changes, they need more resources and more people. They have a really difficult job, and I've always, we've worked with them when we've had issues, and we've always worked very much together on things to resolve them. But can they cover every single business and for every single issue? No, they obviously can't, because they haven't got the manpower or the budget to do so. When it comes to enforcement outside of the UK, and again, I can only speak from our experiences, I think probably 95, even more % than that, of the exploitation that is currently occurring, that when we're speaking to the people that are working for us, is happening in country. It's very rarely that we have come across anything that is happening in the UK. When it does happen in the UK, that's where we've worked in hand with the GLAA. The issue is there at the moment that nobody seems to want to take real responsibility abroad for some of these issues. I don't necessarily think, and I am not an expert, but I don't necessarily think that this is only an issue in terms of the seasonal worker programme. It will be happening in other things as well in terms of recruitment. But there are people that aren't taking responsibility. So by that I mean that certain countries will have laws in place that protect workers, but they're not being enforced. There are certain countries where they're aware of this and it's accepting. There's issues sometimes with people trying to, because an individual to come and work in the UK will have to apply for a visa, and there is issues with those individuals applying for the visas because they have to pay to get to see the embassies or wherever it might be to get those visas. And there's an awful lot more work that could be done around education and promotion of the work that the operators do in those countries, because I realise that they do an awful lot. They try to promote as much as they possibly can, but they need help. Whether that's from the UK government or whether it's the Foreign Office that needs to get more involved, I probably think not. It is the countries that we're going to that needs to take a greater element of the issue and deal with it. It is there, and I know that the experiences of this year will be different for the experiences of last year because of timings and all sorts of things. And I also know the work and effort that the operators are putting in. Everybody can always do more, but we need that assistance in country. And that's where I think the operators have the biggest challenge. We need that help.
I think we've lost Sharon. Sam and Frank, are you still there? Yeah. So maybe I'll move on to that's such a shame. Hopefully Sharon will reappear. But Sam, if I could just ask you from the perspective of being one of the scheme operators, if you could tell me what in your perspective has been one of some of the strengths of the seasonal worker visa scheme in terms of addressing some of these issues, and where there, from your perspective, are gaps, or as Sharon put it, that more help is needed, and how, obviously this is a very complex issue and there is no silver bullet, but what might some of those solutions begin to look like?
So I suppose I'd speak considering it when it was in its pilot form, so the SWP, and then now in its current form as the seasonal worker scheme. Probably main benefit would be certainty. So I would say that's not just from the perspective of being a scheme operator, but for the industry as a whole, i.e. there is a certainty of the supply of labour. Naturally for us as a business, we have certainty in that we know that there's X number of thousand workers that we are going to recruit and place with clients. So, of course, that's very positive for us as a business. I think if you broaden that, actually, you would say that then is positive for the businesses that we supply. They have certainty over the supply of their labour. But then if you take that one step further, it would be the UK has a greater deal of certainty about food security. So I'd say the benefits are quite broad. Of course, I would add, a caveat to that, which is we are still, certainly if you consider the numbers that people like the NFU are talking about, the scheme in its current size is, roughly half of what people like the NFU are suggesting that it needs to be. So there is a caveat attached. But certainly the certainty is positive. I think this is a question that is going to come up later, and that is, well, then what about 2024 onwards? Because that in itself suggests there isn't certainty beyond that point. But if I were to talk about the weaknesses of the scheme at present, and I'm sure this is despite everyone's best intentions, and something that you've mentioned, Kate, it's the late notice. So again, I'm sure you've heard this from plenty of businesses, different operators, and again, Sharon would be the expert on this, but from our experience, agriculture businesses are doing their planning anywhere between 2, 3, 5 years in advance. So if you then contrast that to the matter of weeks notice that we have had in the past of certain elements of the scheme being introduced, that can cause problems. And then a greater deal of consultation and collaboration, I would say, would benefit everybody as well. So, when there is the intention to introduce new elements of the scheme or the scheme itself or something around the numbers, consultation with key stakeholders, such as the people on this call, I think would really, really benefit.
So, if I could just open this up to Sam, but Sharon or Frank, if you would also like to respond to this, given Sam being so clear about the need for certainty with the scheme and for the benefit of practicalities and building preparation into the scheme in terms of with law enforcement and with countries where possibly recruitment's being done from. What is the future for the scheme beyond 2024? There's been specifically no commitment. Is in an ideal world, does the 6-month model work with increasingly distant recruitment? So the significant loss of costs of travel for a 6-month period. Are there future challenges you see coming up with the scheme? This is quite a large question, and are there any structural changes to the scheme that you would recommend to address some of these challenges?
So I'll answer it from a point of view in terms of the issues that farming industry is addressing or having to address because there are labour shortages in many industries. Whether you agree with Brexit or not, it really doesn't matter. But at the moment, in many industries, and in particular, from my perspective, agriculture is extremely short of workers and will continue to do so. So the scheme, if it doesn't continue after 2024, would mean it would be a disaster for agriculture. Farmers would have no choice but to think about where they could move and sort and harvest and do the work that they're doing now in different countries. And what people don't necessarily tend to realise in that is, yes, there is a significant number of seasonal workers, but those seasonal workers also underpin a significant number of permanent workers as well. So if the scheme wasn't to continue past 2024, it would be disastrous for the industry. So that's the point of view from the Labour perspective. Sam, sorry, I cut into you. So
that's all right, don't worry. Yeah, well, I would completely echo those words. Yeah, we certainly think there's a huge amount of sense in continuing the scheme beyond 2024 in an ideal world. Not having a time limit on it, because I suppose from our perspective, we're struggling to see what the benefit of that is really. given that, like Sharon has said, the absolute necessity that the industry has for the staff. In terms of practical suggestions, we've proposed, we wouldn't be the only ones proposing this, but we've proposed it's a 9-month visa, for example, because if you move from a 6 to a 9-month visa, you'll have the workers being able to cover more than just one season. When I say season, I mean in terms of season for a particular crop. So they could, for example, come in the earlier part of the year, work on soft fruit, and then move on to working on the stone fruit, top fruit, for example. And so that in itself is also a benefit to the workers themselves, because, as we've discussed, they are incurring costs to come over here, and these aren't insignificant, especially when you consider what multiple they constitute of what that person's typical monthly wages. So if they are able to stay for a longer period of time, they're able to earn more money and do more of what they came here to do, which is to earn money and increase their standard of living at home. So we'd be proponents of that. And again, this is a practical suggestion. There are certain things which we're restricted in at the moment from a visa point of view. And I'm sure, again, there are good reasons for this, but they could be considered, and that is we can only issue a certificate of sponsorship, COS, 12 weeks before a worker is planning to arrive. And in an ideal world, we think if we could give that person their COS at the time when they're leaving in the current year, so they know when they can come back the next year, that would benefit multiple stakeholders, because one, they've got certainty over when they can come back. Two, we think that there's less likelihood that they can be intercepted by illicit traders in their home country, kind of tempting them by saying that, oh, there's a better offer elsewhere. If they've got some certainty, then that becomes eliminated. And again, like we've said, it's more certainty for the industries, because again, if you ask companies like G's that Sharon works for, would you prefer to have a worker who's worked for you previously and you know for a fact they're going to come back next year, or a fresh worker who you're going to have to train? I think you know which one the industry would choose. So yeah, those are the challenges and some practical suggestions.
Yeah. So, I mean, that sort of leads me on to the question about the I mean, maybe you've already answered this, but the forthcoming 8-week visas, 8-week in duration visas for the poultry workers, which will be valid from November to end of December this year, given the shorter earning time for these, the individuals coming on these visas who are paying presumably the same travel costs, even if there haven't been no illegal fees charged. And they've got such a much shorter time to pay back any costs they've incurred. Do you think there should be any mitigations in place against the increased costs for these workers sustaining debts through the recruitment process?
Well, I can answer it from Proforce's perspective, and that, with some facts, which is in 2021, when we ran that element of the scheme, we made it a requirement that the cost of the visa, so the circa £250, and the associated fees, which shouldn't be overlooked. So, for example, when a worker goes to the visa centre and has to pay for things like booking an appointment and so on, we made it a requirement that that our clients were paying for the visa, the associated fees, and also the travel for the worker. Because, like you say, if that runs into the hundreds of pounds, it's not an attractive or realistic proposition for the worker. So we made that a requirement. I should add as well that some of our clients added the cost of accommodation to be covered on top of that as well. So it's not a scheme requirement, but that's what we as a business are aiming towards again this year. So to address that exact issue, so that the workers have a realistic perspective of being able to earn good money and return and not encounter any debt.
I mean, it sounds to me like there's real potential there for looking at that as a model for the cost of travel and visas being more fairly distributed in general for workers on the scheme. You know, like if that's possible for people who are on the particularly short-term visas, I think, you know, I think what my understanding is what we've seen is obviously it's very clear that recruitment fees are illegal, but then there is sometimes confusion because some fees are not illegal. And we hear of workers having to pay things that are not called recruitment fees, but they are training fees or other fees that to them that might be made to sound legitimate. So I just wonder, as we've also already said in this discussion, you know, the costs anyway without dodgy fees are high. Is there potential to look at a way of distributing the costs so it doesn't fall on workers to take the risk and borrow money?
So I'll just unwrap the fees just a little bit more, because fees in themselves, yes, you are quite right. It is definitely 100% in the UK. It is illegal for a worker to pay, you know, the fees. I get that. The difficulty is it's not necessarily illegal in all of the countries that people are now going to. So it is accepted that it is a legal practice. Now, again, I know coming to the UK that would make it illegal, but this is the difficulty of it all. But also there's the culture and the understanding that in some of the countries that we're travelling to, and please bear in mind that this is very new, that we're only now beginning to travel to some of these countries. So it's knowledge and awareness will grow, and then the situation will change. But when we're now going to some of these countries, there's a culture where if they don't pay, they don't get. And that's a very simple way of describing it. You know, there's far more behind it to that, to the point where when we've had workers come in to us and have a conversation with us about fees and they've paid the fees, quite openly and quite honestly, when you have the initial conversation and you talk about fees, they will turn around and go, no, I've not paid anything. And they mean it. And it's very open and they mean it. When you start asking the questions differently and you start saying to them, so, well, you know, how much did this cost you? Where did this have to come from? And you start explaining it in a slightly different way, the worker then begins to unravel and you begin to understand the depth in terms of the fees, in terms of what are being charged. So there's like I say, it's a very big topic and it's very difficult to unwind everything that's involved in it. And I think then the question that you asked at the beginning is in terms of, you know, is there scope for this? The answer is yes. Have I got the answer to what that scope is? No, I can't answer for the industry. But yes, there is scope there for where things can be improved, and the worker does not have to bear all of those costs. But that, again, is a big subject which needs to be discussed wide openly. But there are so many things that we can do to improve it for the people that are coming to the UK.
That's really helpful. So in terms of workers, maybe not, you know, I think it was really interesting, Sharon, how you described having to ask the question in various ways to get the answer, not because people are lying, but because they don't see it as a fee, or it's not been described to them as a fee. It's been described as a different cost. And I just wanted to, it brings me back to sort of responsibility for where recruitment agencies overseas have breached the rules, either in terms of fees or operating without licenses, and how workers can be supported to speak out. Because it's our understanding that quite often workers, particularly if they have paid a lot of money to come to the UK, they've got limited time to earn that back. You know, quite naturally, they just might think, you know what, I don't want any trouble here. You know, I don't want to get in trouble. I'm not going to say anything. And there's no point in me saying anything because because I won't get compensation for what I've paid anyway. So I mean, I don't know, Frank, maybe if you have any thoughts about how we can, make sure we have systems in place to make sure that the workers who are entitled to redress get it, because as we all know, just in terms of timeframes of going to an employment tribunal, for example, that's not going to happen on a 6-month visa. But we've already talked about the international, who would pay for a fee that was charged overseas. So how can we support workers to speak out and make sure that it's in their interest to do so?
Yeah, I think we, I touched on this right at the beginning about building relationships, and I think one of the key relationships is building the trust with the workers that come into the UK, and trust and awareness, so that they feel confident that they can talk, they can raise issues, not just about the recruitment fees, but any aspect of their employment whilst in the UK. And I think, again, Sam has touched on that time frame. We've got to make the most of that time frame to start building that trust, and that begins with those important messages going to those workers even before they've left their own country, so they're getting that awareness and that understanding. And I know there's been some great work done with the Just Good Work app, pushing that out, not just by ourselves, not just by the scheme operators, but carrying that message by the suppliers, to the employers. So there's a consistency in terms of that approach, and there's a consistency of trying to gain the trust of the workers. And I think once you gain that trust, workers do become more open, they become more trusting, and then I think you can get a better understanding of their whole experience. And I think it's capturing that whole experience which will make the scheme better year on year, because it can be used then to amend and maybe change the scheme or change the approach using that authentic voice of the worker. Because I think ultimately it's the workers that the focus should be on, about what has their experience been like, what has been the good things that they've enjoyed, what are the things that could be better. And of course, we've got our licensing scheme. So as all labour providers are aware to follow through the meeting the licensing standards when recruiting workers, be it in the UK or overseas. And obviously, if any information about mistreatment of workers, anything about the failings of any of those standards should be reported to the GLAA, just so we can look into that further. So I think that the combination of making sure that the license scheme is working for everyone, but also building that, as I say, that trusting relationship with workers at the earliest opportunity, and carrying that right through the duration of the workers' stay here, can only make this a better scheme for the following year.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Sharon and Frank are saying, i.e., it's a complex cultural issue, which is from our perspective here, it's difficult to comprehend until you're out there. And like Frank says, it's also about building trust with the workers. So something that we've been really hot on is trying to be proactive, control our supply chain as much as possible, and focus on education as well, because it's almost like there's this feeling that by the time the workers have paid fees, it's almost too late. So something we've tried to do, for example, is when I talk about owning the supply chain. So, for example, we like to, where possible, set up our own recruitment offices in a country, because then we know it's our staff who are doing the recruitment, and then there's no issue of us having to do due diligence over the people who are doing our recruitment. And then because it's our staff, we know that we can really drill into them the message that anytime you have any contact with the workers prior to us actually having recruited them, it's making it absolutely crystal clear there is no necessity to pay fees to anybody. And not only is there no necessity, it's completely illegal in the UK, as we've mentioned. And in addition to that, then if for some reason we can't have our own station, we've been partnering with bodies from the government. So, for example, in places like Tajikistan, where we'll actually have the government partnering with us to do the recruitment, and again passing the message through the supply chain that way. And then again, we're believers in when don't reinvent the wheel if it doesn't need it. When there is such good resource out there for things like the Just Good Work app, but also the GLAA resources, being very proactive about promoting that at the earliest stage possible in country prior to us having recruited the workers. So at the first contact, and then continuously throughout the stage, reminding people at multiple touch points, such as when they get their documents prior to leaving their home country, when they're in the UK, surveying them and again reminding them at those points about all these resources. So yeah, like I say, what we've tried to focus on is being proactive, gaining trust, but also about education so that we can intercept it at the earliest stage possible.
Could I, sorry, Kate, just if I could add a few things onto this as well. This year, I know I've said it before, and I think others have as well, it has been incredibly difficult. Lateness of, and this is not being critical of anybody or anything, but lateness of announcements in terms of numbers and people, world events in terms of the terrible things that are happening in the Ukraine, threw everything up in the air very, very quickly. So from having a fairly well-established recruitment path or a process, it was just literally thrown up in the air, and not entirely, but almost 40,000 workers had to be found from completely different countries. So there wasn't the time or just simply the ability to do as much due diligence as probably ourselves and others would want to do. However, this year, and Sam is quite right, a lot of what we've done is now about education. When the new people arrive from new countries, they don't trust us on day one. It's all new, it's all different. We build that trust up. So we do all the general things when people arrive on day one. We'll have a conversation with them about how they've got here, where they've come, all that kind of thing. It doesn't stop there, though, because they won't necessarily understand what it is we're trying to achieve or the types of information that we have. We will go back and have a further conversation, not an interview. We'll have a conversation with the people later on, probably 4 or 5 weeks in, when they've got to know us, they've got to know their managers, we've got to know their supervisors, and they will then trust us and start talking to us about their trip here. So we're finding out some of the pitfalls, and then we're educating people in terms of how to avoid them. So that's been this year. We've very much had to discuss, find out, and then educate. So those people that are here with us this year now will go back. They will spread the word. We will talk to them endlessly before they go home about the right processes, what they can do to avoid exploitation. We will do it all in their own languages. You will do everything we possibly can to make people aware of what that route is, so they can come over, as we hope, free of exploitation and free of any control from anybody else. But the trust has to be built. They have to believe us, and that can't happen over a few days. We've built that trust over a period of time, and next year's experience, as I said earlier, will be completely different because we are building on what we have learned now and educating people, and they're taking it back home.
So just thinking about how hard it is to build this trust. And I would imagine it is also linked in part to, as we've discussed earlier, the fact that workers, by speaking out, stand to risk quite a lot, and wouldn't necessarily think there would be a route to redress. I'm just wondering if there's more of a role for increased monitoring of the scheme, independent monitoring, so the onus isn't so much on the workers themselves to speak out. Obviously, the workers should have routes to speak out and should be supported to speak out. But so there's independent monitoring, so the pressure isn't all on the workers.
Just on that, Kate, I think it's a really good point to make. And again, it's something that we've been looking at this year working with the scheme operators, and one of the things we've worked on, and it's nearing completion, is a film, which again was very much about capturing workers' experience on film. So we worked, and Proforce, led on this work, but it was supported by ourselves, by the other scheme operators, and we also brought on board the Work Right Centre, because we wanted to get that, as you said, that almost independent voice, who are representing or being that voice of the worker embedded in that film. And I think what has come across is that advice, that input we've had from the Work Right Centre has really helped shape the production of that film. And it's something that we want to carry on into like I say, into next year. We piloted this year a meet and greet at the airport, where some of the GLAA officers met the workers as they arrived in this country, but met them not in a formal sense. So again, it was away from the, if you like, the formalities of arriving in the UK. It was when they're on the coach, and it was just to introduce themselves to the GLAA, to explain who we are, to give out some free resources, and to start building again that element of trust, because we do know, as a law enforcement agency, we've got a lot of work to overcome to get them to feel confident and comfortable. And the idea being, what we want to take forward is to make those contacts more frequent as they settle into work, and do that in a way that isn't in any way sort of organized, but just a drop in, just to check in and see how those workers are faring. Because for us, again, going back to the earlier point, it starts to give us an understanding of where we can be best placed to give the support to the workers, and making good use of our limited resources. And I think with the the collaboration with the scheme operators, but equally with the collaboration from those that can advocate and speak on behalf of workers. And in that film, those workers have also got the opportunity to contact the Work Right Centre if they wish to do so. And we know that the Work Right Centre have got a range of advisors speaking multiple of different languages, and they may feel more comfortable doing that. And I think it's then giving the workers the choice and the options to make and decide what they feel comfortable with, rather than giving them a single route that might not appeal, or might not be comfortable for all.
Thank you. I think we are almost out of time. It's really great to hear the meet and greets have worked well, and I do wonder if there'll be potential to expand those. I don't know if you're in a position to say anything about that, Frank.
No, but it's certainly something I feel we need to capture and understand. Yeah, I think it's a bit of a time lag here. It's okay. So what I do think is that all the learning, and I think as Sharon has said, and Sam, from this year, we need to capture that and help us to understand how we could make the scheme better for all concerned next year. And I think the meet and greets will be part of that, along with lots of the other work that the employers have undertaken, the scheme operators, as well as the different government agencies involved in the scheme.
I think we are almost out of time. I don't know if anyone has anything anything burning that we've missed before we wrap up. I would like to thank you all for your time and your expertise.
I'd just like
go
to add
ahead,
one
Sharon.
thing, if it's okay. Your point about monitoring, I actually think is really, really important. The question, and I don't know, I haven't got the answer, so please don't think that, but I think one of the questions that's in my mind and is burning is where monitoring should happen. Is it just in the UK? Because that would, in my mind, mean that it's happened, you're doing the monitoring once in the UK and the issue can have occurred. Should there be more monitoring in the home countries, or should it be a mixture of both? In my mind, it's a mixture of both. But what's missing at the moment is the monitoring that's happening in the home country. And I don't necessarily mean that from the operator's point of view in terms of what they're doing when they're there and doing the recruitment. It's more about the monitoring of how people got to that point where they then did apply for a job through the operators. So there's something about if we're going to do more monitoring, it has to provide something different in terms of the outcome. We sort of, if you've done it in the UK, we'd know what the outcome was. We need more help. We need more monitoring in various different places. It's not just one answer in terms of monitoring.
Kate, may I make a final remark?
Yes, please do.
Something that we would be keen to see further strengthening of is the requirement for the workers when they travel that distance, as we talk about, and spend all that money, to have some guarantee and security over the number of hours that they're going to be working. So, we're aware that the scheme talks of no 0 hours contracts. However, I think from a practical point of view, we would all agree if a worker has travelled that distance and they're working 10 hours a week, it's going to be hugely dissatisfying for them. So for example, we guarantee our workers 32 hours as a minimum each week. And if it's not 32 hours of work, then it's the pay which backs that up. And so if there's something we would like, it would be further strengthening around that, because like I say, we're all in this for the same reason, which is we want to make sure the workers are well looked after, motivated workers, and they're more motivated when they're well looked after. It doesn't seem palatable that someone could travel thousands of miles to be working 15, 20 hours a week. It just doesn't make sense. So yeah, if there's something we could ask for strengthening around, it would be more around that.
It's a really important point, Sam. Thank you very much for raising it. And just to fully understand, so your recommendation would be for that to be a requirement of the scheme?
I think it would certainly help, because I think the requirement that is there at the moment it does constitute some progress. But like I said, I think there's further strengthening that needs to be done, because just because there's no 0 hours contract, like I say, from experience, you'll know workers, because they're traveling so far and want to earn money to send back to their families, anything less than, we find, 32, 40 or so hours is just really quite dissatisfying, and the numbers just don't add up for them. So if there could be some sort of requirement along those lines, then yeah, I think it would be better for everyone involved.
And in terms of the model you have, how are you able to ensure that workers do get those 32 hours?
Oh, well, multiple ways. So again, Sharon might know, we've, in our terms of business that we sign with our clients, it makes very clear that we only accept them as a client on the basis that they accept that they must pay the worker 32 hours, even if they're not working 32 hours. That's if we are supplying the worker on a direct supply model. And then we also have the alternative model, which is we supply what we call managed workers, i.e. they technically are Proforce employees, but we send them out to the client site. And if they are Proforce's employees, then we know from our own payroll department that they must be paid at least 32 hours a week. And separate to that, as we all know, best practice, we run reports from our payroll to show us if we think anyone has missed out, and then we top up the pay on that basis and do spot checks. So we ensure that it's being done contractually, but also in practice, and then through monitoring as well.
And are workers able to whistleblow if they're not getting it? And has that ever happened?
Yeah, we've got multiple avenues that workers can tell us things like that. So, for example, See Here, Speak Up. So we partner with them, and we make sure that it's advertised to the workers inside their caravan, but also as part of their documents that they receive from us. So if they want to do that anonymous type of whistleblowing, they can do that. But then, because of the nature of the business that we are, the workers have contact details for us, so they can just contact either us or our payroll department and just highlight something like that. If there has been an administrative error and someone hasn't been paid 32 hours, then we're able to address that really quickly.
Thank you. And if I can just ask one further question, actually, about how that works. If someone's 6-month visa doesn't coincide with the seasonal jobs, so they may be moving jobs during the duration of their visa, and there's a gap, would the 32 hours also cover that period, the days it takes to move between jobs with different growers, for example?
Yeah. So the way we operate that, yes, it does. So, for example, we paid out circa £100,000 last year in payments such as those, so to cover workers when they're between jobs. So there's that, but also, and it's linked to a requirement of the scheme, which we do agree with actually, which is around transfers. So transfers are available for anyone without offering a reason even for needing a transfer. So we try to be very proactive in that sense as well, whereby if a worker's not happy, of course we'll try to address the issue there and then, but if that's not possible, then we'll transfer them to another placement. So we feel like we're doing the best that we can at present, knowing what we know, to help them in terms of, are they at a placement that perhaps isn't working for them and the grower? Right, let's move them somewhere else so they can have more work. And then if there are gaps, then we've got that safety net of the 32 hours guarantee as well.
Thank you. I mean, that sounds. You're entirely right. That the mismatch between expectations of workers believing they're coming to a full-time job and then getting a job that isn't a 0-hour contract but is a very few hours is shocking, and definitely the scheme needs to look at models to address that. It's really useful to hear more about yours. Thank you very much, everyone, for giving up so much of your time this afternoon. Unless there's anything else burning to add, I think we should probably wrap up. But again, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep, thank you.